Long before doctors gave it a name, before chromosomes were counted like tiny constellations under glass, there were children born who carried in their faces a softness, a sameness, a look families recognized. They were born in mud brick houses, stone cottages, royal chambers, and shepherds' tents. In ancient cities along the Nile and mountain villages, where the wind never seemed to stop speaking. They were born as all children are born, wet with life, crying, fragile, and full of breath. Tonight, imagine a quiet village thousands of years ago. The lamps burn low. A midwife wraps a newborn in wool. The mother, exhausted, reaches out trembling hands. The baby's eyes are shaped in a way she has not seen before. The child's muscles are soft. The cry is gentle. The midwife hesitates for only a moment before laying the child in the mother's arms. In the ancient world, difference was often interpreted through the language of gods and omens. In places like ancient Rome, physical differences could be seen as signs, sometimes divine, sometimes ill-fated. The Roman philosopher Seneca the Younger once wrote harshly about discarding infants deemed weak. Not every family followed such thinking, but the possibility lingered like a shadow. In a society that valued strength and military prowess, survival itself was sometimes treated as a privilege. And yet, history is never only one story. Archaeologists have found burials. In the ancient cemetery at Saqqara in Egypt, skeletons suggest individuals with Down syndrome lived into adulthood. They were buried with care. Their bones tell a quieter truth. Someone fed them, sheltered them, and considered them worth mourning. We do not know their names. But we know they were not all abandoned. In medieval Europe, difference was often folded into religion. The world was understood through God's will. A child born with differences might be seen as touched by heaven or a test of faith. In monasteries, some found refuge. The slow rhythm of bells, prayer, and labor created spaces where those who could not farm efficiently or fight effectively might still belong. But outside monastery walls, life could be precarious. The Middle Ages were not gentle times. A child who learned more slowly might be labeled a natural fool, a term used in medieval courts. Some fools were protected roles in royal households. It was a strange mixture of exploitation and protection. In Renaissance paintings, art historians have identified figures that appear to show the facial characteristics of Down syndrome. Whether intentional or coincidental, such images suggest that people with these features were present, visible. As centuries passed, scientific curiosity grew sharper and colder. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe was obsessed with classification. Plants were categorized, animals dissected, skulls measured. Human difference became something to label. In 1866, John Langdon Down published a paper describing a group of children with similar physical traits and intellectual disabilities. He used language rooted in racial theories, calling the condition Mongolian idiocy, a term now offensive. Yet, paradoxically, he also advocated for kinder treatment and education, founding a training school. The 19th century saw the rise of large institutions. Families were pressured to send children to asylums. The idea was framed as humane and scientific. Specialized care, structured routines, moral instruction. But as numbers grew and funding shrank, many institutions became overcrowded warehouses, rows of iron beds, long corridors echoing with footsteps, windows too high to see out of. In the United States, places like Willowbrook State School became infamous for neglect and abuse. Though founded with the promise of care, such institutions often stripped residents of individuality. Children grew up separated from their families, sometimes for life. The early 20th century brought a darker chapter. The eugenics movement gained traction. Lawmakers and scientists argued that society should prevent those deemed unfit from reproducing. Forced sterilizations became legal in parts of the United States after Buck v. Bell. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. infamously wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Many individuals with the condition were caught in this net, subjected to policies denying bodily autonomy. The most horrifying expression of eugenics emerged in Nazi Germany. Action T4 targeted people with disabilities. Children and adults with intellectual and physical disabilities were systematically murdered. Doctors and nurses participated. Families were deceived. Death certificates were falsified. It was an attempt to erase difference entirely. And yet, even in that darkness, there were stories of resistance. Parents who hid their children, clergy who spoke out, nurses who delayed paperwork. Small acts of defiance against a machinery of cruelty. After World War II, the world recoiled. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. In the 1950s and 60s, parents started organizing. They refused to accept that their children belonged behind locked doors. Advocacy groups formed, demanding education and community inclusion. A major scientific breakthrough came in 1959, when French geneticist Jérôme Lejeune discovered that Down syndrome was caused by an extra chromosome 21. For the first time, there was a clear biological explanation. It helped dismantle myths. With this discovery came new challenges. Prenatal testing developed in the late 20th century. Allowed expectant parents to know if a fetus had trisomy 21. Some saw this as empowering information. Others worried it would lead to fewer births and reinforce the idea that their lives were less valuable. The ethical debate continues softly in hospital corridors and brightly lit laboratories. Meanwhile, institutions began to close. Investigative journalism exposed horrific conditions. Public outrage led to reforms. The movement toward deinstitutionalization gained momentum. Children who once would have spent their lives in isolation began attending public schools. After laws such as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, families discovered something transformative. When given support, many individuals with Down syndrome could learn to read, hold jobs, form friendships, and live semi-independent lives. The ceiling of expectation rose. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, representation shifted again. Actors with Down syndrome appeared. In films and television, models walked fashion runways. Athletes competed in the Special Olympics. The world saw not symbols or diagnoses but people. Organizations like the National Down Syndrome Society and Down Syndrome International worked to promote inclusion, healthcare access, and human rights globally. World Down Syndrome Day, observed on March 21st, symbolizing the triplication of chromosome 21, brings awareness. Yet progress has never been even. In some parts of the world, stigma persists. Limited medical resources, lack of educational support, and deep-rooted misconceptions still shape lives. History does not disappear. It lingers in attitudes passed quietly from generation to generation. If you drift back further in your imagination to that first ancient village, that mother holding her newborn, you can see how history is not a straight line but a tide. Sometimes compassion rises, sometimes fear does. The treatment of people with Down syndrome has swung between protection and persecution, visibility and invisibility. But beneath policies and philosophies, something steady has always existed: the bond between parent and child. In Roman villas and medieval huts, in Victorian townhouses and modern apartments, there have been mothers and fathers who learned their child's smile, who adjusted their pace, who celebrated small milestones as grand victories. Archaeological bones, faded manuscripts, court records, medical journals, they tell us what societies believed. But they rarely capture the quiet moments. A sibling teaching a game slowly, a village baker slipping an extra roll, a teacher discovering that patience opens unexpected doors. Today, many individuals with Down syndrome live longer. In the early 20th century, life expectancy was often under 10 years. Now, many live into their 60s. They form advocacy groups of their own. They speak at conferences about self-determination. They insist on being heard. The story of how people with Down syndrome were treated is not solely a story of cruelty, nor solely one of kindness. It is a mirror reflecting humanity's struggle with difference. When societies feared weakness, they hid it. When they worshipped strength, they rejected vulnerability. When they began to understand biology and human rights, space slowly widened. And so, as you settle into sleep, imagine the centuries like pages turning gently. In each era, a child is born. In each era, someone decides whether that child is a burden or a blessing. History shows both answers have been given. But more and more, the answer tilts toward belonging. The lamps dim in the ancient house. The monastery bell fades. The iron doors of institutions close for the last time. A classroom door opens instead. A playground echoes with laughter that sounds like any other laughter-bright human. The tide, though never perfect, moves gradually toward dignity. And somewhere across time, that first mother still holds her child close, whispering the oldest promise in the world. You are mine. You are enough. Sleep now. The night stretches softly, and the story keeps walking, slow and unhurried, like footsteps along a shoreline where the tide has only just begun to turn. As the 20th century moved forward, families who once felt isolated began to find one another. In church basements and community halls, parents gathered in circles of folding chairs. They shared stories in low voices, at first stories of doctors who spoke too bluntly, of neighbors who did not know what to say, of school principals who gently suggested special facilities instead of classrooms filled with other children. But as the evenings went on, something steadier grew: resolve. In Britain, organizations such as the Royal Mencap Society advocated for people with intellectual disabilities, pushing back against the assumption that institutional life was the only option. In the United States, parent-led movements worked alongside lawmakers to ensure that public schools opened their doors. In 1971, a young boy named Daniel R. was denied access to public education in Pennsylvania because he had Down syndrome. His parents fought back in a landmark case, Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children v. Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The settlement declared that children with intellectual disabilities were entitled to a free public education. It seems obvious now, but at the time it was revolutionary. A simple sentence in a legal document quietly reshaped thousands of lives. Across the ocean, similar transformations unfolded. The old institutions' massive, echoing buildings once thought modern began to close. Photographs from the 1960s and 70s show rows of identical beds, peeling paint, and children staring at the camera with expressions that are hard to name. When journalists exposed these conditions, the public was forced to look directly at what had been hidden. Change did not come instantly. Some institutions resisted reform. Some communities worried about what inclusion would mean. But slowly, steadily, children with Down syndrome began attending neighborhood schools. Teachers learned new strategies. Classmates learned patience. And sometimes, without even realizing it, they learned empathy. Medical care improved too. In earlier centuries, many babies with Down syndrome were born with congenital heart defects that went untreated. By the late 20th century, pediatric cardiology had advanced dramatically. Surgeons repaired tiny hearts no bigger than a plum. Antibiotics prevented infections that once proved fatal. With each medical breakthrough, life expectancy rose. There were cultural shifts as well. The language people used began to change. Words that had once appeared in textbooks and court rulings were recognized as harmful. Advocacy groups encouraged people-first language, saying "person with Down syndrome," rather than defining someone entirely by a diagnosis. It was a subtle shift, but words shape worlds. In the arts, representation blossomed slowly but meaningfully. In 1987, actor Chris Burke starred in the television series Life Goes On, portraying a teenager with Down syndrome navigating ordinary life school dances, sibling rivalries, dreams for the future. For many viewers, it was the first time they had seen someone with the condition as a central character rather than a background figure. Sports offered another stage for dignity. The Special Olympics, founded by Eunice Kennedy Shriver in 1968, created opportunities for athletes with intellectual disabilities to compete, train, and celebrate achievement. Stadiums filled with cheers. Medals were awarded. But more important than medals was visibility, the reminder that ability exists on a spectrum, and that competition can be joyful rather than exclusionary. By the early 21st century, the conversation had deepened further. Adults with Down syndrome began speaking for themselves in public forums. Self-advocacy groups emerged, emphasizing autonomy and decision-making. Rather than being spoken about, individuals insisted on being heard. There were milestones in media too. In 2012, Lauren Potter, known for her role on Glee, addressed the United Nations about bullying and inclusion. Her voice carried across an international chamber once reserved for diplomats and heads of state. It was a powerful contrast to centuries when people with intellectual disabilities were denied even basic schooling. And yet, the story remains layered. Advances in prenatal testing have brought complex ethical questions. In some countries, a high percentage of pregnancies diagnosed with trisomy 21 end in termination. Advocates worry that this trend reflects lingering stigma. Others emphasize parental choice and preparedness. The debate is not simple. It lives in private consultations and quiet reflections late at night. In places with fewer resources, challenges persist. Access to healthcare, early intervention programs, and inclusive education varies widely. Some families still face isolation. In rural areas, Myths may linger, old echoes of curses or shame. History does not vanish completely. It fades unevenly, like ink in sunlight. But there are new kinds of visibility too. Social media platforms have allowed families and individuals to share daily life openly. Photos of first steps, graduation ceremonies, wedding dances. Campaigns celebrate diversity. Hashtags spread messages of acceptance across borders faster than any medieval bell could ring. Research continues gently in laboratories. Scientists study how the extra chromosome affects development, searching for therapies that might support memory or reduce health complications. Ethical guidelines now emphasize respect and consent lessons painfully learned from past abuses. Perhaps one of the most profound changes is expectation. Where once doctors advised institutionalization within days of birth, many now connect parents to support networks. Where once society assumed permanent dependence, many now envision employment, relationships, and meaningful contribution. In some cities, adults with Down syndrome work in cafes, offices, libraries. They commute on buses. They fall in love. They advocate for accessible housing. They participate in politics. The arc bends slowly, but it bends toward inclusion. If you drift again through time, imagine placing side by side two scenes. In the first, a 19th century asylum corridor, silent but for footsteps. A child sits on a bench, unnamed in records, except for a diagnosis. In the second, a modern classroom, bright with posters. A student raises her hand. She reads a sentence aloud, slowly but clearly. Her classmates listen. Her teacher smiles. The distance between those scenes is filled with centuries of belief, fear, ignorance, curiosity, cruelty, compassion, reform. It is filled with parents who refuse to give up, with journalists who exposed injustice, with scientists who looked deeper into cells, with activists who marched and spoke and organized. The treatment of people with Down syndrome across history reveals something fundamental about humanity: how we respond to vulnerability. In times of scarcity and rigid hierarchy, vulnerability was often hidden or eliminated. In times when rights expanded and empathy grew, vulnerability became part of the shared human story. There is still work to do. Inclusion is not uniform. Respect is not universal. But the narrative has shifted from concealment to recognition, from pity to partnership. And now, as this gentle history settles like dust on a shelf, imagine once more that first newborn in the ancient village. Imagine all the children since millions across millennia, each one arriving without knowledge of the centuries before them. They arrive only with breath. The way they are met depends on the world around them. And the world, though imperfect, has learned. It has learned that intelligence has many forms. That joy does not require comparison. That a life measured by chromosomes alone misses the wider mystery of being human. So the lamps dim again. The pages of history close softly. Across time, the voices that once whispered doubt grow quieter, and the voices that speak belonging grow clearer. Sleep now with this thought. History shows us where we have been, but it also shows us what we can become. And in the long, slow turning of centuries, dignity, though sometimes delayed, has a way of returning, like morning light slipping gently through an open window. The window is open now, and dawn is not sharp but silver, resting lightly over rooftops and treetops and hospital buildings where new lives continue to begin. In maternity wards across the world, when a baby is born with Down syndrome today, the moment is still layered. There may be surprise, there may be fear, but there is also far more knowledge than there once was. Instead of silence or shame, there are brochures, support groups, websites, and sometimes even another parent waiting gently in the hallway to say, "You are not alone." This would have been unimaginable in centuries past. In the ancient world, a child's survival often depended on immediate judgment. In medieval times, survival depended on charity and family endurance. In the age of institutions, survival often meant separation. In the era of eugenics, survival itself was threatened by ideology. And yet here we are, in a time where the question is no longer whether people with Down syndrome should exist in society, but how society can better include them. The shift from exclusion to inclusion did not happen all at once. It moved through classrooms first. Teachers began to experiment with inclusive education, placing children with intellectual disabilities in general classrooms with appropriate support. Studies showed something remarkable. Not only did students with Down syndrome benefit, but so did their peers. Empathy increased, patience deepened. Diversity became ordinary rather than exceptional. Employment followed slowly behind education. For decades, many adults with Down syndrome were limited to sheltered workshops, segregated environments with minimal pay. But advocacy movements argued that real inclusion meant real jobs. Today, in many countries, supported employment programs help individuals work in retail, hospitality, childcare, government offices, and creative industries. The idea that contribution must look one specific way has softened. Medical understanding has deepened too. Doctors now monitor common health conditions associated with Down syndrome, thyroid issues, hearing loss, vision challenges, with preventive care rather than crisis response. Early intervention programs provide speech therapy, occupational therapy, and physical therapy during the earliest years when development is most flexible. What once might have been labeled simply as delay is now approached with structured support. Language continues to evolve. In earlier eras, labels were heavy and absolute. Now, conversations focus on strengths as well as challenges. Many families describe their children not as tragedies or burdens but as teachers of patience, resilience, and joy. While this perspective does not erase difficulty, it reframes difference as part of human variety rather than deviation. And still, the story remains complex. There are places in the world where services are scarce, where families must advocate fiercely for basic accommodations, where stigma remains stubborn, whispering old myths into modern ears. History leaves traces in culture. It takes time for attitudes to catch up with laws. Even in progressive societies, inclusion can be uneven. Some schools lack funding. Some employers hesitate. Some media portrayals fall into stereotypes, either overly sentimental or unrealistically inspirational. The balance between recognizing capability and acknowledging support needs is delicate. Yet perhaps one of the most profound changes in recent decades is self-advocacy. Adults with Down syndrome now speak at conferences, serve on advisory boards, and participate in research design. They write books, create art, and form romantic partnerships that challenge old assumptions about capacity. The question has shifted from what can they do to how can we remove barriers so they can do it. In 2011, the United Nations officially recognized March 21st as World Down Syndrome Day, symbolizing the triplication of chromosome 21. Around the globe, landmarks light up in blue and yellow. Schools encourage students to wear mismatched socks. Awareness campaigns circulate across screens. It is both symbolic and tangible, a reminder that difference can be visible and celebrated rather than hidden. If you listen closely to history, you can hear the change in tone. In ancient records, silence or superstition. In medieval chronicles, charity or curiosity. In institutional files, diagnosis numbers and bed counts. In eugenic policies, cold calculations. In modern advocacy, names, voices, stories. Names matter. Where once a person might have been recorded only as female, age 7, imbecile, now there are biographies, graduations, social media profiles, wedding invitations, advocacy speeches. Each life layered with detail. And yet, perhaps the most constant thread through all centuries is relationship. A sibling teaching a board game slowly. A father walking hand in hand to a bus stop. A teacher waiting patiently for a sentence to form. A friend defending against teasing on a playground. A coworker adjusting a schedule to make space. History often focuses on institutions, laws, and ideologies. But daily life is shaped by ordinary interactions. For every cruel policy, there were also private kindnesses. For every era of ignorance, there were individuals who chose compassion. As you drift deeper into this gentle unfolding of time, imagine a tapestry. Each century is a thread, some dark, some bright. The darker threads are undeniable: abandonment, confinement, sterilization, murder under totalitarian regimes. These cannot be softened. They must be remembered so they are not repeated. But woven alongside them are threads of care. Families who refused to hide their children. Reformers who exposed injustice. Doctors who sought understanding rather than control. Advocates who marched. Individuals who insisted on their own voices. The tapestry is not perfect. It is still being woven. Today, conversations about inclusion intersect with broader discussions about disability rights, neurodiversity, and human dignity. The movement is no longer only about access but about belonging, not only about surviving but about thriving. And so we return, gently, to the quiet rhythm of breath. A child born in ancient Egypt, buried with care. A child in medieval Europe, protected within monastery walls. A child in the 19th century, studied and labeled. A child in the 1930s, endangered by ideology. A child in the 1970s, entering a public school for the first time. A child today, growing up with classmates, therapists, online communities, and dreams. History has not always been kind, but it has learned. It has learned that intelligence cannot be measured solely by speed, that worth cannot be assigned by productivity, that vulnerability does not diminish humanity, that diversity enriches communities. The story of how people with Down syndrome were treated in history is, at its heart, the story of how societies define value. When value is tied narrowly to strength, conformity, or economic output, those who differ are pushed aside. When value is rooted in shared humanity, difference finds space. The night grows softer now. Across continents, families tuck children into bed. Some children with Down syndrome need help brushing their teeth or choosing pajamas. Some read stories aloud. Some whisper their own stories back. Their lives are not museum pieces or case studies, they are ongoing, ordinary, extraordinary all at once. If the past teaches anything, it is that fear shrinks the world, and understanding expands it. The centuries behind us are filled with both mistakes and courage. The centuries ahead remain unwritten. But the direction has shifted toward inclusion more often than exclusion, toward listening more often than silencing. And so let the timeline settle like a calm sea. From ancient burial grounds to modern classrooms. From whispered superstitions to public advocacy. From confinement to community. The lamps go out one by one across history's long corridor. What remains is something simple and steady. A recognition that every life, regardless of chromosome count, carries its own rhythm, its own light. And as the story finally slows, like a page turning at the very end of a book, there is only this gentle truth to rest with. Human dignity, though sometimes delayed by centuries, has a quiet endurance. It returns, it grows, it asks to be honored. Sleep now in that knowing. The night has grown very still now, the kind of stillness that feels wide rather than empty, as though time itself is stretched out like a calm ocean under a silver moon. The story continues, not loudly, not urgently, but with the same steady breath that has carried it across centuries. If we look even closer at the present, we begin to see something subtle and powerful: identity. For most of history, people with Down syndrome were described only by others, by physicians, priests, lawmakers, philosophers. Their lives were interpreted from the outside. But now, increasingly, they describe themselves. Self-advocates speak about friendship, independence, faith, love, work, and ambition. Some talk openly about the challenges they face: health complications, misunderstandings, barriers in employment. Others speak about pride in who they are. They reject the idea that their lives are tragedies. They insist on complexity. In universities, disability studies programs now explore how societies construct the idea of normal. Scholars examine how architecture, education systems, and workplace expectations often exclude not because of inherent inability, but because of inflexibility. This shift in thinking from fix the person to adapt the environment marks one of the quiet revolutions of our era. Families, too, are changing in how they speak about their experiences. A generation ago, parents were often advised not to expect much. Today, expectations are broader. Many children with Down syndrome graduate from high school. Some attend college programs designed to support inclusive higher education. Others pursue vocational training, entrepreneurship, or creative arts. There are fashion models with Down syndrome walking international runways. There are entrepreneurs running small businesses. There are artists exhibiting paintings filled with bold color and emotion. There are married couples building homes together. These realities would have seemed nearly unimaginable in the 1800s, when institutional walls were considered permanent solutions. And yet the story remains gentle in its caution. Inclusion is not a straight path. Even now, some adults struggle to find stable employment. Healthcare disparities persist. In some regions of the world, diagnosis can still lead to isolation. Change does not move at the same speed everywhere. But something fundamental has shifted. The assumption of invisibility has weakened. In earlier centuries, people with Down syndrome were often kept inside homes, behind institutional doors, erased from census records. Now they appear in advertising campaigns, political discussions, social media feeds, and classrooms. Visibility does not guarantee equality, but it challenges silence. The ethical conversations continue too. Advances in genetic research prompt important questions. Scientists explore potential therapies to support cognitive development or reduce health risks. At the same time, disability advocates emphasize the importance of respecting identity and avoiding narratives that frame difference solely as a problem to be eliminated. These discussions are complex and layered, but they are happening openly, something that would have been rare in previous eras. If you step back and look across the entire timeline from ancient burial grounds to modern advocacy conferences, you begin to see a pattern not only of treatment but of understanding. In the beginning, difference was mysterious. Later, it was moralized. Then it was classified. Then it was institutionalized. Then it was targeted by ideology. Then it was medicalized. And now, increasingly, it is humanized. Humanized, that word holds weight. It means seeing not a condition first, but a person. It means recognizing strengths alongside support needs. It means understanding that value is not conditional. Across history, societies often revealed their deepest fears and how they treated those who were most vulnerable. Fear of weakness, fear of burden, fear of imperfection. But vulnerability is part of every human life, whether visible or not. Illness, aging, dependency, these touch everyone eventually. Perhaps this is why the movement toward inclusion feels like something larger than one diagnosis. It reflects a broader rethinking of what it means to belong. Imagine for a moment a village in the future. Children play in a square filled with evening light. Among them is a child with Down syndrome. No one pauses at the sight. The child runs more slowly, perhaps, or laughs louder, perhaps. A teacher nearby watches, not with concern but with ordinary attentiveness. The difference is present but not central. It is simply part of the texture of community. That vision is not fully realized everywhere, but it is closer than it once was. And so, as this long and winding history draws toward rest, we return once more to the quiet image that has followed us from the beginning, a parent holding a newborn child. In ancient times, that parent may have faced fear without guidance. In medieval times, faith may have shaped the interpretation. In industrial times, institutions loomed. In the early 20th century, ideology threatened. In the mid-20th century, science brought explanation. In the late 20th century, advocacy brought reform. In the 21st century, inclusion continues to grow. Through all of it, the small human heartbeat remained the same. History can feel heavy, especially when it carries chapters of neglect and violence. But it also carries resilience. The resilience of families who loved fiercely. The resilience of individuals who found joy even in confinement. The resilience of communities that reimagined themselves. Treatment has changed because understanding has changed. Understanding has changed because voices were raised. Voices were raised because lives mattered. Now the night deepens fully, the centuries fold inward like pages closing gently. Across time, from stone villages to digital cities, one quiet truth echoes. The measure of a society is found in how it treats those who need patience, protection, and respect. The story of people with Down syndrome in history is not finished. It is still being written in classrooms, hospitals, workplaces, homes. It is written in policies and in playground conversations. It is written in research labs and in family kitchens, but it is no longer written in silence. The air grows softer. And as sleep approaches, let the final image be simple and calm. A world slowly learning that dignity does not depend on speed of thought or symmetry of features, but on the shared fact of being human. The tide that once carried exclusion has begun to ebb. In its place, something steadier rises: acceptance, imperfect but persistent. And in that steady rise there is rest. The story moves even more quietly now, like the last pages of a book read beneath a dim lamp, where the words grow softer and the meaning settles deeper. If we listen carefully to history, beyond the loud moments of law and ideology, we hear something else: the steady rhythm of ordinary days. For most people with Down syndrome across history, life was not made of grand speeches or court rulings. Tasks may have been adapted without formal recognition. A slower learner might tend animals rather than manage trade. A gentler temperament might make someone a beloved helper among younger children. History books rarely record such adjustments, but human communities have always improvised around difference. In medieval towns, where survival required cooperation, roles were often fluid. Not everyone farmed at the same speed. Not everyone read Latin texts. Some listened, some carried, some comforted. While superstition and misunderstanding existed, so did practicality. A community could not afford to discard everyone who worked differently. Later, during the rise of industrialization, societies became less flexible. Factories demanded speed and precision. Urbanization separated extended families. Institutions grew not only from cruelty but from a belief in efficiency, the idea that difference should be managed separately. The industrial age valued uniformity, and those who did not fit the mold were often removed from sight. But even within institutional walls, humanity did not disappear entirely. There were caregivers who smuggled small kindnesses into rigid systems, a nurse who brushed a child's hair gently, a teacher who lingered over a lesson, a cook who saved a favorite portion. These acts do not erase systemic injustice, but they remind us that compassion survives even in constrained environments. As the late 20th century unfolded and institutions closed, communities faced a new challenge. How to include, not merely house. Inclusion requires more than location, it requires relationship. Children who entered mainstream schools sometimes faced teasing. Some classmates did not understand why one student learned differently. But many children adapt more quickly than adults expect. When inclusion begins early, difference becomes familiar rather than foreign. Parents, too, began to speak openly about their journeys. Memoirs appeared. Support networks expanded. The narrative shifted from isolation to connection. Where once a diagnosis might have been delivered with quiet despair, it now often comes with resources, reassurance, and realistic hope. Healthcare has continued to improve. Early interventions strengthen communication. Therapies encourage independence. Research explores ways to support memory and delay conditions associated with aging. Life expectancy, once tragically short, has expanded dramatically over the past century. And with longer life comes new questions: aging, retirement, long-term housing, autonomy. These conversations are still unfolding. The story is not complete. It is evolving. Across cultures, attitudes differ. In some places, disability remains heavily stigmatized. In others, inclusion is actively celebrated. Global advocacy groups work to share knowledge and reduce disparities, recognizing that dignity should not depend on geography. Perhaps one of the most meaningful developments in recent decades is the understanding that people with Down syndrome are not a single uniform group. Like any population, they vary widely in personality, talents, challenges, and dreams. Some are quiet. Some are outspoken. Some love music. Some love mathematics. Some prefer routine. Others crave adventure. History once flattened them into categories. Modern voices restore individuality, and so the story stretches gently into the future. Imagine a classroom 50 years from now. Assistive technology is seamless. Educational systems are flexible by design. Workplaces measure contribution in diverse ways. Public spaces are built with universal accessibility from the start. The presence of people with Down syndrome is not treated as inspirational or exceptional. It is ordinary. Ordinary can be a beautiful word. For centuries, difference was dramatized, either pitied or feared. Now, increasingly, it is normalized. The shift from spectacle to normalcy is one of the quiet triumphs of progress. But history teaches humility. Gains can be fragile. Rights must be protected. Compassion must be renewed in each generation. Memory matters because forgetting past injustices makes repetition easier. The long arc of treatment, from abandonment to acceptance, reflects something larger about humanity's capacity to grow. Growth is rarely smooth. It stumbles. It resists. It regresses, but it can also learn. As this bedtime story draws near its final hush, we return once more to breath, the simplest measure of life. Across millennia, a baby inhales for the first time. The world around that baby determines much: safety, education, opportunity, belonging. But that first breath is universal. It carries no ideology. It holds no stigma. It simply declares existence. History has shown us many responses to that breath. Some harsh, some tender, increasingly more tender. Perhaps that is the quiet hope carried forward, that societies continue to choose tenderness over fear, inclusion over isolation, understanding over myth. The lamps in ancient houses have gone dark. The monastery bells have quieted. The iron gates of institutions have rusted shut. The classrooms remain lit a little longer. And somewhere tonight, a child with Down syndrome falls asleep after a day of ordinary adventures, school lessons, laughter, small frustrations, shared meals. Not a symbol. Not a case study. Simply a child. The story of how people with Down syndrome were treated in history is long and sometimes heavy, but it bends toward recognition. The recognition that dignity is not earned by perfection, and that humanity is wide enough to hold many ways of being. The tide continues its slow, steady motion. And now, as the pages settle completely, there is only quiet. Rest in this. History has been imperfect, but it has moved. And in that movement, there is hope gentle enough to sleep beside. Now the story is almost whispering. The centuries that once felt heavy begin to feel distant, like mountains seen from far away. Still real, still part of the landscape, but soft by space and light. Remembering how people with Down syndrome were treated in history. Not to dwell in sorrow, but to understand how fragile and how powerful human attitudes can be. In ancient times, survival was uncertain for many infants. Medical knowledge was limited. Superstition often filled the gaps. Yet some children were cared for tenderly enough to leave behind bones that tell archaeologists they lived for years. Care existed even when understanding did not. In medieval eras, belief shaped perception. A child might be seen as a divine test, a soul especially innocent, or in darker interpretations, a burden. Visibility sometimes meant vulnerability, but it also meant familiarity. The industrial age changed that. As cities expanded and productivity became a measure of worth, those who did not fit the rhythm of factories were often pushed aside. Institutions rose not only from cruelty but from a misguided belief in separation as efficiency. The language of care masked isolation. Then came the early 20th century, when pseudoscience hardened into policy. The idea that society could improve itself by limiting who was allowed to exist. This became terrifyingly influential. For people with Down syndrome, this period was one of deep danger. It reminds us how quickly fear, when dressed in scientific language, can justify harm. But the story did not end there. After the horrors of World War II, the global conscience shifted. Human rights discourse grew stronger. The idea that every person holds inherent dignity gained traction. Families organized, laws changed. Institutions closed, education opened, medicine advanced. And perhaps most importantly, people with Down syndrome themselves began stepping forward as visible members of society. The shift from being spoken about to speaking is no small thing. When someone tells their own story, it changes the narrative entirely. Instead of a diagnosis, you hear a voice. Instead of a label, you see personality. Instead of a statistic, you meet a human being. With preferences, humor, stubbornness, kindness, dreams. History once flattened difference into categories. Now individuality expands the frame. Still, the story is not perfect. Around the world, there remain places where stigma is strong, where resources are thin. Where misunderstanding persists. In some cultures, families still face pressure to hide difference. In others, they are supported openly. Progress is uneven, but the direction matters. If we zoom out across thousands of years, the pattern becomes clearer. Humanity has struggled with difference in many forms. Often the first instinct has been fear or exclusion. But over time, exposure leads to understanding, and understanding can lead to acceptance. The treatment of people with Down syndrome reflects that broader arc. From invisibility to confinement, to categorization, to cautious inclusion, to growing celebration. Celebration does not mean denying challenges. Down syndrome can involve medical complexities, developmental delays, and lifelong support needs. Acknowledging dignity does not erase difficulty. But history teaches that difficulty is not a justification for dehumanization. And so the final stretch of this long bedtime journey returns to something simple: relationship. Policies change because people care. Care grows because relationships form. Relationships form because individuals are present. Presence breaks down fear. When children grow up alongside classmates with Down syndrome, difference becomes familiar. When coworkers share shifts, Stereotypes weaken. When communities include rather than segregate, empathy becomes ordinary. Perhaps that is the quiet revolution making inclusion ordinary, no grand announcement, no dramatic turning point. Just the steady normalization of belonging. Imagine once more that ancient mother from the beginning of our story. She holds her child and does not know what centuries will bring. She cannot foresee institutions or advocacy movements or genetic discoveries. She knows only this: the child in her arms is hers. Across time, that instinct to protect, to nurture, to love has been the strongest counterforce to cruelty. When societies drifted toward exclusion, families often resisted quietly. When systems failed, individuals stepped forward. When language harmed, new language emerged. When walls were built, they were eventually questioned. History is not only a record of mistakes, it is also a record of correction. Now the night is very deep. The timeline stretches behind us like a long road fading into mist. People with Down syndrome were once misunderstood, sometimes feared, sometimes hidden, sometimes harmed. But they were also loved, protected, defended, and eventually recognized more fully as equal members of the human family. The movement toward dignity has not been perfect or complete, but it has been real. And so, as this final whisper settles, hold on to the gentlest truth threaded through every century. Human worth has never depended on symmetry, speed, or chromosomes. It has always rested in something quieter and stronger. The simple fact of being human. The lamps are out now, the pages are closed. The tide is calm. History continues, but for tonight, it rests. And in that rest, there is peace. The silence now is not empty. It is full of everything that has come before, and everything still quietly unfolding. When we look back across centuries, history feels vast and distant, made of kings, laws, and institutions. But in truth, treatment of people with Down syndrome was decided in small spaces: kitchens, classrooms, hospital rooms, village squares. History is shaped in ordinary rooms. In one room, a century ago, a doctor stood at a hospital bed, speaking with heavy certainty. It would be best, he might have said, to place the child in an institution. The words hung like fog. Parents, uncertain and frightened, often trusted authority. Many believed they were doing what was right. But in another room, decades later, a different doctor said, "Your child needs support, but they can learn." If a person was never offered employment, society assumed they could not work. Isolation was mistaken for incapacity. But when doors began to open, something remarkable happened. Many individuals showed that, with time and support, they could acquire skills. They could memorize lines in plays. They could operate cash registers. They could navigate public transport. They could form deep friendships. They could express complex emotions. Not every individual, of course, because human ability varies widely, as it does in any population. But the ceiling of expectation lifted, and lifting a ceiling allows light in. There is a quiet lesson in this long history. The greatest limitations were often not biological, but social. When society narrowed opportunity, lives narrowed. When society expanded access, lives expanded. This does not mean challenges disappear. Health conditions still require monitoring. Some individuals need lifelong assistance. Families still face moments of exhaustion and uncertainty. But support and dignity can coexist with difficulty. The world today is not free of bias. In some places, diagnosis still carries stigma. In some communities, people with Down syndrome remain underestimated. In others, they are overly idealized. True inclusion lies somewhere in between, neither pity nor pedestal, but partnership. Perhaps the most beautiful change across history is this: people with Down syndrome are increasingly recognized as complex individuals. They can be stubborn, they can be funny, they can be moody, they can be affectionate, they can disagree, they can advocate, they can surprise you. In earlier eras, complexity was denied to them. They were reduced to a condition. Now complexity is being restored. And so the long arc of treatment becomes something more than a record of harm and reform. It becomes a reflection of humanity learning to widen its definition of us. At first, Us meant the strong. Then it meant the productive. Then it meant the educated. Now, increasingly, it means everyone. Every chromosome count. Every pace of learning. Every way of being. There is still distance to travel. Laws must be protected. Healthcare must remain accessible. Educational systems must continue evolving. Attitudes must keep softening. But compared to ancient eras of abandonment, industrial eras of confinement, ideological eras of elimination, the present holds a deeper awareness. The awareness that difference is not a flaw in humanity, it is part of its design. As this story stretches into its final hush, imagine a timeline glowing softly in the dark. At one end, misunderstanding. In the middle, struggle. Toward the other end, recognition. And beyond that, something even quieter and steadier, belonging. Belonging means no longer asking whether someone deserves space. It means assuming they do. The ancient mother from our beginning did not know she was part of a vast historical arc. She only knew the warmth of her child's skin. Across centuries, that warmth has remained the same. Societies have changed around it, laws have shifted, language has evolved. Science has advanced. But the simple human truth has always been present, waiting to be acknowledged. Every life carries weight. Every life carries meaning. Every life alters the world in ways both small and immeasurable. The night is very still now. History, with all its lessons, has quieted. The tide that once carried fear has softened into something calmer. The future remains open, not perfect, not guaranteed, but more aware than before. And so, with one final gentle breath, the story rests. From ancient burial grounds to modern classrooms, from whispered superstition to public advocacy, from confinement to community, the journey has been long. But it has moved toward light. Sleep now in that movement. Sleep in the knowledge that humanity can learn. Sleep in the certainty that dignity, once recognized, has a way of enduring. The pages close softly. The lamps fade. The story continues, but for tonight, it is enough. The darkness now is soft and velvety, not heavy but protective, like a blanket drawn gently over history itself. We have walked a very long road together, from ancient uncertainty to modern recognition. Quiet corners remain before sleep takes over. One of those corners is memory. For centuries, people with Down syndrome lived lives that were rarely recorded. Their names were not written in official histories. Their achievements were not preserved. Contributions dissolved into the ordinary flow of daily life. History tends to remember rulers and revolutions. It forgets gentleness. But gentleness is part of the story too. Imagine a medieval winter evening. A small cottage lit by firelight. A young man with Down syndrome carves wood by the hearth. No one writes about this scene. No historian records it. Yet it happened countless times. Lives woven into family and village. Fast forward to the 19th century. An institutional dormitory, rows of narrow beds. A caregiver adjusts blankets. Some institutions were harsh, yes. But within flawed systems, there were moments of humanity. A lullaby hummed. A hand held. Then the 20th century brings its turbulence. Parents begin refusing to let their children disappear. They demand classrooms instead of wards. And here's something remarkable. Much of the progress for people with Down syndrome did not begin with governments. It began with families. Mothers and fathers who refused to accept low expectations. Siblings who defended and included. Advocacy often starts quietly. A conversation, a petition, a support group in a living room. These small gatherings ripple outward. By the late 20th century, the narrative had shifted from segregation to integration. By the early 21st century, it shifted to inclusion. Integration places someone in a space. Inclusion reshapes the space so everyone belongs naturally. This difference may seem subtle, but it carries weight. Integration says, you may enter. Inclusion says, you were always meant to be here. And perhaps that is the gentlest turning point of all. Today, many individuals with Down syndrome grow up seeing others like themselves. In books, television, workplaces, and online communities, representation matters because it reduces isolation. It affirms existence. Still, history teaches vigilance. Gains achieved can be fragile. Economic hardship, political change, or shifting cultural attitudes can influence perception. That is why remembering the past matters. Not to dwell in sorrow, but to guard progress. The treatment of people with Down syndrome reveals something enduring about human societies. We are always negotiating our understanding of difference. At first, difference feels unfamiliar, then uncomfortable. Then it becomes understood, and eventually it becomes ordinary. Ordinary, not in the sense of unremarkable, but accepted. There is a quiet beauty in that. Imagine a future generation reading about early institutionalization or eugenics with disbelief. The same way many now read about other injustices of the past. Imagine them asking, why would anyone think that way? That question itself would signal growth. The arc of this history has been uneven, yes. It has included pain that must never be minimized. But it has also revealed resilience that deserves recognition. People with Down syndrome have always been here. In every century, in every culture, in every kind of community. What has changed is not their presence, it is society's response. And responses can evolve. As we come to the final edges of this long, gentle telling, the story becomes less about treatment and more about recognition. Recognition that humanity is broader than once imagined. Recognition that worth cannot be measured by uniform standards. Recognition that vulnerability is not weakness, but part of the shared human condition. The world today is not perfect. But compared to centuries of silence, confinement, or danger, it holds more awareness, more protection, and more possibility. The tide that once carried exclusion has receded significantly. The tide of belonging continues to rise. And now, as the very last hush settles over this long historical journey, there is only one more image to hold. A child, any child, asleep peacefully. The centuries before them do not press heavily on their dreams. They sleep in a world that has learned slowly and imperfectly to make more room. The story of how people with Down syndrome were treated in history is not only a record of what was done. It is a testament to what can change. Human hearts can change. Human systems can change. Human understanding can deepen. The night is complete now. The timeline rests. The future waits quietly, unwritten but hopeful. And so the story, at last, grows still. Sleep gently. History has spoken. And in its long whisper, it tells us this. Dignity, though sometimes delayed, endures. The night feels endless now, but not in a lonely way, in a peaceful way. Like the sky stretching wide above quiet rooftops. The story has traveled far, yet there is always another soft layer to unfold. Another gentle reflection before sleep fully settles. Let us look for a final time, not at institutions or policies, but at time itself. Time is patient. In ancient eras, people did not know about chromosomes or genetics. They interpreted the world with the tools they had: myth, faith, instinct. Their responses to difference were shaped by survival and belief. Some responses were harsh. Some were protective. Understanding was limited, but humanity was still present in small acts of care. Centuries later, science arrived with new explanations. But explanation did not immediately produce compassion. Sometimes knowledge was used to categorize rather than to uplift. Labels became rigid. Systems became controlling. The idea of normal hardened into something narrow. And yet, even then, time kept moving. Ideas that once seemed unshakable eventually softened. The certainty of segregation gave way to the possibility of inclusion. The confidence of eugenics collapsed under the weight of moral reckoning. The assumption of incapacity was challenged by lived experience. Time reveals the weaknesses of rigid thinking. What remains durable is not exclusion, it is relationship. Across every century, the strongest protection for people with Down syndrome has been connection. A mother refusing abandonment, a father demanding education, a sibling insisting on fairness, a teacher choosing patience, a community opening a door. Laws can mandate access, but belonging grows through repeated human contact. Perhaps that is the quiet center of this entire history. Proximity changes perception. When people are hidden, they are misunderstood. When people are present, they are known. When they are known, fear decreases. When fear decreases, dignity grows. The story of how people with Down syndrome were treated in history is therefore also the story of visibility. At first, hidden, then institutionalized, then gradually reintroduced. Now increasingly visible, visibility carries responsibility. It asks societies to respond thoughtfully. It asks for support systems, healthcare access, education, employment opportunities. It asks for continued listening. And listening is something humanity has learned slowly. Today, adults with Down syndrome speak about their own dreams, independence, friendship, meaningful work, creative expression. They express frustration when underestimated. They celebrate milestones others once thought unreachable. They advocate for themselves and for the next generation. That voice, self-directed and confident, is something history once denied them. The arc from silence to speech may be the most powerful transformation of all. And yet, the story is not triumphal. It does not pretend that every problem has vanished. There are still disparities. There are still debates. There are still moments of prejudice. But compared to centuries of invisibility or danger, the present holds a greater awareness of shared humanity. Awareness is not the final step, but it is a foundation. Imagine a child born tomorrow, decades from now. That child may grow up in a world where inclusive design is standard, where classrooms adapt naturally, where technology supports communication seamlessly, where diversity is woven into daily life without special announcement. Perhaps that child will read about institutionalization and eugenics, the way we read about distant injustices, with disbelief and resolve that such thinking must never return. History becomes teacher rather than threat. The tide imagery that has followed us from the beginning feels fitting now. There were times when the tide of fear rose high, sweeping people into confinement or danger. There were times when the tide of compassion ebbed, leaving isolation exposed. But overall, across the long shoreline of centuries, the water has gradually moved toward inclusion. Not in a straight line, not without setbacks, but unmistakably forward. The measure of progress is not perfection. It is direction. And the direction, however gradual, has shifted toward belonging. As the final quiet settles, let everything soften. The ancient villages, the monastery bells, the factory smoke, the institutional corridors, the courtrooms, the classrooms, the advocacy rallies, the family kitchens. All of it part of one long human effort to understand difference and to decide how to respond to it. Now we know more than we once did. Now we expect more than we once did. Now we see more than we once did, and seeing clearly is a gift. The story does not end, it simply continues beyond our telling. History will keep unfolding, generations will keep learning. The world will keep adjusting. But tonight, in this moment of rest, it is enough to recognize how far the journey has traveled. From fear toward familiarity, from exclusion toward embrace, from silence toward voice, from margins toward membership, the sky outside is still. The timeline rests like a calm horizon. And in that horizon there is something steady and reassuring. Human dignity, though tested and delayed, has proven resilient. Sleep gently with that thought. The story has been long. The lesson has been clear. The future remains open. And for now there is peace. The night has grown so quiet that even the echoes of centuries seem to have settled into a gentle hush. We have traced the long arc of history, watched ideas rise and fall, seen fear harden and soften, witnessed exclusion give way slowly to belonging. Before sleep fully takes us, there is one final reflection. History is often described as a series of events. But when we look at how people with Down syndrome were treated across time, we see that history is also a mirror. It reflects what societies value. In eras that valued physical strength above all, those who appeared different were vulnerable. In eras that valued rigid productivity, those who learned or worked differently were sidelined. In eras that valued ideological purity, those who did not conform were endangered. But when societies began valuing rights, dignity, and diversity, the treatment changed. The chromosome never altered across these centuries. What altered was the lens through which it was viewed. That lens is powerful. A lens of superstition sees curse or omen. A lens of fear sees burden. A lens of narrow science sees defect. A lens of compassion sees a person. A lens of inclusion sees a community member. And humanity has been slowly adjusting that lens. The most profound shift may not have been legal or medical, it may have been emotional. It has been the movement from seeing people with Down syndrome as other, to recognizing them as us. That small shift other to us changes everything. When someone is other, they can be isolated. When someone is us, they are protected. For centuries, people with Down syndrome existed in the fragile space between those two categories. Sometimes protected by family, sometimes exposed to society's harshness. Now, increasingly, they are claimed openly as part of the collective. And with belonging comes responsibility. Societies must provide education, healthcare, employment opportunities. safe housing, protection from abuse, opportunities for joy. Because belonging is not passive. It is active care. Perhaps the quietest truth in this entire long story is this: progress did not come from pity. It came from recognition. Recognition that intelligence is diverse. Recognition that contribution is varied. Recognition that dignity does not depend on comparison. Recognition that vulnerability is universal. We are all in different seasons of life, dependent on others. Childhood, illness, aging. The idea that independence alone defines worth is an illusion history has slowly begun to unravel. People with Down syndrome have reminded the world, sometimes without intending to, that community is stronger than individual perfection. And now, in the present, as awareness grows and systems improve, there is space not only for inclusion, but for celebration. Not exaggerated, not sentimental, but genuine appreciation for diversity within humanity. The story does not claim that injustice has vanished. It does not pretend the road ahead is without obstacles. But compared to ancient abandonment, medieval superstition, industrial segregation, and ideological brutality, the present moment carries more light. Light born from learning. Light born from advocacy. Light born from love repeated across generations. If the earliest chapters of this history were marked by uncertainty, and the middle chapters by struggle, the later chapters are marked by awakening. An awakening to the idea that difference does not diminish humanity, it deepens it. And so we reach the final stillness. Imagine once more that very first image. A parent holding a newborn child, with features they do not yet understand. Across centuries, that moment has repeated millions of times. What has changed is not the child. What has changed is the world waiting outside the door. The world is not perfect, but it is more prepared, more informed, more compassionate than before. History has not erased its mistakes, but it has learned from many of them. And that learning is the quiet hope we carry forward. The timeline stretches behind us like a river, now calm after long rapids. The current still moves, but gently. There is nothing more to prove, nothing more to argue. Only the soft conclusion of a long human journey toward understanding. People with Down syndrome have always belonged to the human story. It simply took humanity time to fully recognize it. The lamps are out, the centuries are quiet. The future breathes softly in the dark, and in that darkness there is peace. Sleep now. The story rests. And dignity endures. The quiet is complete now, but there is still one last softness to settle into, like the final ripple across water after a stone has already sunk. We have spoken of ancient times and modern reforms, of fear and compassion, of silence and voice. But before we close entirely, let us rest in something even simpler than history. Let us rest in humanity. Across thousands of years, societies changed their language, their laws, their science, their beliefs. But beneath all of that, there were always moments that did not belong to ideology or policy. A child laughing. A hand reaching back when another hand reached first. A shared meal. A birthday candle. A quiet hug after frustration. A small victory celebrated loudly. These moments existed in ancient villages. They existed in medieval towns. They existed even in institutions, though constrained. They exist now in classrooms and kitchens and workplaces. History often measures treatment in systems, abandonment, segregation, integration, inclusion. But lived experience is made of smaller things. For a person with Down syndrome centuries ago, life might have been limited by the time they were born into. But even then, they experienced affection, frustration, curiosity, boredom, joy, the ordinary range of human feeling. That is the part history sometimes forgets. We have traced the arc of treatment, how society responded, how structures shifted, how understanding deepened. But beneath every century was an individual life unfolding in its own rhythm. No life was identical, no story uniform. And that individuality is perhaps the most important truth of all. There is no single historical experience of Down syndrome. Some were protected, some were protected. Some were harmed. Some were cherished, some lived briefly, some lived long. Some were misunderstood, some were deeply loved. History is wide enough to hold all of that. What has changed most clearly is not the existence of people with Down syndrome. It is the collective willingness to see them fully. To see capacity alongside limitation. To see adulthood, not perpetual childhood. To see contribution in many forms. to see autonomy as something to nurture, to see dignity as inherent. When societies learned to see more fully, treatment followed. The movement from invisibility to visibility may be the quiet triumph of the modern era. Not spectacle, not sentimentality, simply presence. Presence in neighborhoods, presence in workplaces, presence in media, presence in conversations, presence in policy decisions. And presence changes stories. When someone is present, you cannot reduce them to a theory. You must encounter them as a person. That encounter reshapes history. The question we began with, how were people with Down syndrome treated in history, now feels less like a single answer and more like a journey. They were sometimes feared, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes confined, sometimes endangered, sometimes protected, increasingly included, but always human. Always here. The night has grown very still. If we listen carefully, there is no longer the sound of heavy doors or courtroom debates or ideological speeches. There is only breath, steady, quiet, universal. Breath is the same in every century. It is the simplest reminder that before classification and judgment, there is life. And life asks for space. Across history, space was sometimes denied. Over time, it has been reclaimed. Slowly, persistently, irreversibly in many ways. The future will bring new questions as every future does. New technologies, new ethical conversations, new social shifts. But the foundation built over the last century, the recognition of shared dignity, is stronger than it once was. That strength is the inheritance passed forward. Now truly, the story has reached its gentlest edge. From ancient sands to modern cities, from superstition to science, from segregation to self-advocacy, from margins to membership, the arc has moved. Not perfectly, not without pain, but undeniably. And so the final image is simple: a world still learning, a humanity still growing. A dignity that was always there, now more widely acknowledged. The tide is calm. The lamps are out. The centuries are quiet. Rest now. The story has unfolded as far as it needs to tonight. And in the stillness, one truth remains steady and clear. Every life belongs in the human story.